is the relation of legal theory to structure, especially institutional structure. And I want to devote today's class to a general social theoretical discussion of structure. The place of structure, of structural vision, in classical social theory and in contemporary social science. And then finally, at the end, the relation of that to legal theory. So, inevitably, today's discussion will be very abstract and will deal with a very difficult topic, but a topic of fundamental importance in social theory and indirectly in legal theory. So I must ask for your undivided attention and your patience for this very difficult topic as we go through it. I'm going to divide my presentation today into 4 parts. First, the idea of structure in classical social theory, in classical European social theory, and particularly in Marxism. Second, the idea of structure in contemporary social science, and particularly in the most influential social science, economics. Third, the basic elements of an alternative approach to structure. That is, an approach that I want to propose to you, and which is not so much the outline of a social theory as it is some of the elementary constituents or building blocks of such a theory. And then finally, fourth, at the end, the relation of this idea of structure to the problems of legal theory that we have been discussing in the previous weeks. And after each of these 4 steps, of course, I'm going to stop and invite your engagement. Now then, first, structure in classical European social theory, and especially in its most consummate expression, Karl Marx's theory of society and history. Nothing even remotely approaches it in influence, and especially in influence on the left forces and parties and movements in modern history. The central idea, the revolutionary insight at the core of this classical social theoretical view of structure, and especially Marx's view, is that the structures of society are made and imagined. They are not natural. We made them. They are ours. They are us. They are projections of us. And if we were to radicalize this central insight, we could think of it this way, that these permanent structures are, as it were, a kind of frozen fighting. There is a continuous struggle in our historical experience over the terms of our access to one another. This structure is temporarily interrupted or relatively contained, and the long interludes of temporary interruption and relative containment then generate the structure. So in each historical circumstance, there is an underlying regime a set of institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions related to them that shape the surface routines and conflicts of social life. And most importantly, those activities by which we create the future out of the present through contests over the use of economic capital, political power, and cultural authority. This underlying framework of arrangements and assumptions is what we could also call, to use an equivalent term, hallowed in the history of political and social theory, the regime. The theory of structures is the theory of regimes. Regimes in a large sense, not just political regimes, but this fundamental template of social life. The paradigm of this revolutionary insight, the model for it, was Karl Marx's critique of English political economy. So Marx said the English economists represented the arrangements that they studied as if they were permanent and universal laws of economic life, when they were in fact only the laws of a particular regime, the regime that he labeled capitalism. So we could take the same idea and use another metaphor, to which I alluded in an earlier class, the metaphor of the musical chairs. So the music is the persistent fighting, the struggle, the practical and the visionary strife over the terms of our access to one another that fills our historical experience. When the music stops, that is to say the strife is interrupted or contained, everyone sits down in the chairs are the structures. That's the basic idea of structure in classical social theory, and especially in Marxist social theory. And it is an idea of immense fertility and many-sided significance. And my disposition, always, in social theory, as a social theorist, is not to let go of that idea, but to radicalize it. As we shall see, this is not the disposition that has prevailed in the history of social theory and in the history of social science. The disposition that has prevailed is not to radicalize it, but to correct its supposed excesses and perversions by diluting it, by watering it down. In Marx's theory of society and history, the revolutionary idea that I've just described, in intuitive terms, so you can capture the essence of it, is circumscribed, it is surrounded, it is compromised by a series of illusions, which I want to call the illusions of false necessity. And so what we know as Marxist theory of structure is the combination of the revolutionary insight with these illusions. And there are three paramount illusions of false necessity. The first is the closed list illusion, according to which there is in history a restricted menu of regimes or of structures. That's a closed list. In Marx, they are the modes of production. Famously, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and then socialism. And this first illusion, the closed list illusion, already suggests that if programmatic thought, that is the proposal of alternatives, has any role, its role is restrictive and would be at best to trying to advance one of these options in the closed list over another. But we can't change the composition of the list. The second illusion is the indivisible system illusion, according to which each of these regimes or structures is an indivisible system. All of the parts fit together, and the whole system must be replaced all at once or not at all. Now, this idea, the indivisible systems idea, has a momentous practical consequence. The practical consequence is the binary view of politics, according to which there are basically two kinds of politics. There is the revolutionary substitution of one system for another, and there is the reformist management of a system. Now, I believe that I mentioned in an earlier class that in our own situation today, the main role of this idea seems to have become an alibi for its opposite in the following way. The believer in this thesis of indivisible system, of the indivisible structure, says real change, fundamental change, would be the substitution of one system for another, and specifically of capitalism by socialism. Now, if that's not in the cards, if it's not feasible, or if it were feasible but would be too dangerous because some great calamity might come out of it, like, for example, the communist dictatorships that in the name of socialism attempted to replace capitalism, then what's left to do is to administer the established world through some form of ameliorative reformism. That's the consequence. In this way, the idea of revolution is turned upside down and used as a pretext for its opposite. If we can't have fundamental change, or if we could have it but only in a form that would be too dangerous, what's left is to humanize the existing world. And this has become, in fact, the dominant posture of the progressives. They appear on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. The third illusion of false necessity is the historical laws illusion, according to which history has a script. And this script, these laws, govern the foreordained succession of these indivisible systems in history, and also define the regularities of each system. Now, if you combine the first illusion, the closed list illusion, with the third illusion, the historical laws illusion, the consequence is wholly to negate the space of programmatic thinking. Any attempt to invent an alternative in any form is denounced as, quote, voluntarism. We don't need to have a project because, to put it in the starkest terms, history has a project for us. What we need is to follow the historical script. And the practical consequence of making a mistake about the historical script, about what it is defeat. We will be defeated in politics. History will teach us otherwise. It will bring us back to heel. It will reaffirm the script. And we must enact the script. So I'm stating it very directly, very brutally, very crudely, in order to make clear the content of these illusions. This isn't the way in which these ideas are typically presented in the subsequent history of social thought. There's a lot of hemming and hawing. And as I said, the predominant approach has been to defend them by diluting them. So, for example, by conceding that culture or consciousness has some relative autonomy, or that politics, in the narrow sense of the contest over the mastery and uses of governmental power, has some relative autonomy from the history of structure. And so what results from all of this is the combination of the central revolutionary insight, the illusions of false necessity, and then these successive dilutions or compromises. Yes?
Well, I guess I wonder if this view that history has a
script,
if it's actually like epistemically distinguishable from, or logically distinguishable from the, say, the modern social scientific view. I mean, obviously, history will play out in a certain way.
You mean the modern scientific view in natural science?
No, well, I guess what I mean is, like, is that actually a meaningful statement? That history will play out in a certain way. And the question is, to what extent can we predict how it will play out, right? It is true that we are mere, individual actors in
But I wanted to understand the initial part of your statement. Are you relating this to the dominant explanatory approach in fundamental physics, for example?
No, I'm not going there. I'm merely saying that it is simply true that in the future, the moment we are living in now will be seen as a historic moment. That is simply kind of an understanding of time, and it is true that whatever we do today will contribute to some extent to the formation of what will become history. The question is merely to what extent can we predict what will occur in the future, right? And Marx is saying we can predict it quite well. We know how this will play out, and others are saying we can't. I guess I'm just trying to.
But I don't think this is a discussion about determinism or causality in some general way. It has a particular focus. So the particular focus is that there's a succession of regimes in history. And these are the regimes. So capitalism has its flaws and is eventually destabilized and followed by socialism and so forth. So it's not some kind of generic discussion about determinism and indeterminacy or causality, the limits to causality. It's not about that at all. And after all, in natural science, causality appears in many different ways. So if we were to expand this discussion into a discussion of natural science, it would be a different conversation. So there's for example, in modern physics, contemporary 20th century physics, one could say that the causality has almost disappeared. There isn't a discussion of causality. There's a discussion of structure. And the whole idea of causal inquiry, which characterized 19th century physics, has largely vanished. On the other hand, for example, in natural history, in the life and earth sciences, we have a very different idea of causality. And it's important to remember it because it's easy to associate mistakenly an inclusive determinism with a scientific worldview. But we have a counterexample in the life and earth sciences, in what we call the natural historical paradigm of explanation, in which it appears that there are three characteristic elements. One element is that the basic types of things are mutable. So, in the fundamental physics of the 20th century, there's the idea that there are abiding elementary constituents of nature described by the standard model of particle physics. And they're there forever. They don't change. By the way, this idea is actually inconsistent or contradicted by the discovery in the second decade of the 20th century of the historical character of the universe. One of the consequences of which is that there's reason to believe that there was a moment early enough in the history of the present universe, or in extreme conditions later in the history of the universe, like black holes, in which these elementary particles could not have existed. And the laws governing them, the laws, symmetries, and constants of nature, as we now describe them in the cooled down and differentiated universe, could also not have existed. So this is a contradiction in the present form of the worldview of fundamental physics. It is contradicted by the discovery of the historical character of the universe and the conception of cosmology as a historical science. And then we have natural history, as I said. So in natural history, there are these three ideas. One idea is the mutability of types. There's no closed list of the basic types of things. For example, animal species. They are emerging and dying. And what distinguishes them from one another is itself mutable. It's not just that the list of things is plastic or mutable, but it's also that the way in which they differ from one another is also mutable. So, for example, an igneous rock does not differ from another igneous rock in the same way in which a metamorphic rock differs from another metamorphic rock, and so forth. Now, second, we have the principle called hysteresis, or path dependency. The evolution of nature, not just with life, but before life, is the result of many loosely related causal sequences, not of a single causal succession. So, for example, the dominant form of mammalian evolution has been through the placentals, not through the marsupials. But why is that? It seems that there's a purely accidental element, that the marsupials were caught in a part of the world, of the land masses of the world, which was later isolated. in Australia. And so that the causal succession has been influenced by the completely accidental effects of plate tectonics, the movements of the surfaces of the continents on the Earth, which has no intrinsic relation to the advantages or disadvantages of the marsupials versus the placentals and so forth. The third principle of natural history is the coevolution of the phenomena with the laws. For example, the so-called laws of Mendelian genetics cannot be really said to have existed before the emergence of multicellular organisms. Because that would be just like a metaphysical claim. The laws were there, they were just waiting for an occasion to apply. So the regularities emerge together with a phenomenon. What results from all of this is a completely different idea of causation. So we don't have in natural science any single and simple idea of determinism or causality. We have multiple ideas, and they turn out to be in conflict with each other. So in any event, this view of classical social theory that I'm exemplifying by Marxism is a particular view, focused on the succession of these indivisible regimes, with these three illusions of false necessity that I just described. Now, I think that what has happened on the whole with respect to this idea of history in Marxism is that no one believes in it anymore. The so-called Marxists also don't believe in it. And literally, now, they use the vocabulary, for example, capitalism, or the idea of class conflict in capitalism, but they take the words out of the social theoretical context which gave meaning to the words. So there's this confusion. Now, with the dissolution of the classical idea, that's the problem. I think, in general, it's a great misfortune for the history of social theory, because what should have been done is to take the central insight that I described, that the arrangements of society are made and imagined, and to free them from the incubus of the illusions of false necessity. That's what I mean by radicalizing. And of course, that doesn't mean we don't have causal explanations. It doesn't mean that we deny the reality of constraint on structural change. But we have to have some other account of constraint that doesn't undermine the central insight. That these regimes are in fact our creation, that we made them, that we can remake them, and so forth. So then there's this huge confusion. It's like I said before, I think, in one of these classes, the narrator in Proust saying, we are friends with those whose ideas are at the same level of confusion as our own. That's what results. So we have this idea, then we have the opposite of the idea, and we try and resolve the contradictions by some form of equivocation, rather than by clearly reshaping the idea. Now, the one more thing I want to say about this classical conception of structure is that it goes together, as I suggested in a previous class, with a certain idea of interest and of agency. So the idea is that class interests have an objective context. Each class has objective interests determined by its place in the mode of production and in the historical succession of modes of production. And as class conflict extends in scope and increases in intensity, the objective content of these interests become patent, clearer. I think that's just the opposite of the truth, as I mentioned before and will come to again. But that's the Marxist view. And if you make a mistake about what the class interests are, the price of the mistake will be political defeat or disappointment. History will show you otherwise. That's the idea. So I think the consequence of all of this is that we have this classical idea of structure, but we have it in a form in which it has become literally unbelievable. I think it's impossible to believe in it, because the claims that it makes are claims that are denied both by what we discover through historical learning, our investigation of history, and by our political experience. So, for example, take that idea of the second illusion, the indivisible systems illusion, with its consequence, the binary view of politics. Systemic change, the wholesale replacement of one system by another, is for the most part a limiting case, and in a sense, a fantasy. That's not how structural change takes place in history. Real structural change in history, when it takes place, is almost always fragmentary or piecemeal. But it can become revolutionary if it continues in a particular direction. And this idea that there are these 4 or 5 systems in world history and that you either replace them or you don't is just a fantasy. It has no relation to what our historical experience is really like. So, what has not happened in the history of social theory is that this idea has been discredited on terms like the terms I just stated, and then what comes next, and then replaced by another idea that would preserve what's valid in it. That's what you might have expected. But that's not what's happened. I think it's much more accurate to say that the classical theory of structure has been, as I said, watered down, diluted, and people have continued to use the vocabulary that drew its meaning from that social theoretical context, while no longer believing in the social theoretical assumptions that give meaning to the words that they're using. So you can understand how this fact has become the source of immense confusion. That's what we have. So that's the first set of things I wanted to say, and that's already quite a lot. Yes?
Immense confusion in that the only language we have is fitted to these certain systems, and that we don't have the language for...
No, I mean, there are lots of other languages. There are languages in contemporary social science or policy discourse. There are languages that don't relate to this structural idea at all. Because, as I next want to suggest, the dominant posture of the policy discourse and of contemporary social science has been to suppress structural vision altogether. So the way in which they've gotten rid of the illusions of false necessity is by also getting rid of the idea of structure. So that's a different thing. So it's not necessary to use these words. But what I'm saying is that the people who do use these words, like capitalism and class conflict and so forth, use them in a way that's incoherent for the most part, because it draws its theoretical meaning from a set of social theoretical presuppositions in which they have ceased to believe. But there are others who use other words that don't at all relate to this social theoretical history. That's modern social science.
I can see how that's particularly true for those who are using some of the Marxist terminology if they don't really believe it, but why would that apply to capitalists? If someone's a capitalist and a true believer.
Well, what is capitalism? I can ask you. So I think capitalism is a conception which is a questionable conception. So there have been many forms of a market economy in history. They've appeared many times in history, in many civilizations at many moments. And when is it capitalism? So maybe Karl Marx's most significant way of distinguishing capitalism was that he thought under capitalism, labor was a commodity which could be bought and sold. So that's one criterion among many for defining what capitalism would be. But then Marx, or at least the Marxists, also often thought that there could be a market under socialism, market socialism. So when is it capitalism and when is it not capitalism? It's just a confusion. A market economy arises in early modern Europe. Then we label it capitalism, it's a system. And when does it cease to be that system? So that's what's not clear.
Right, I can see how it's not precise because there's a whole spectrum, and so I guess throwing out another criteria could be something along the lines of the primary driver of manufacturing goods and services is not the government, but a series of private individuals. Now, obviously, there's a spectrum because the government.
No, because as I say, the idea of capitalism is not the idea of a market economy. Capitalism is not a market economy. A market economy is an indeterminate idea. It can exist in many different forms. Going back to the first class, I said, even at the most abstract level, a market economy has two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization, the number of agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension has to do with the degree of control that each of those agents has over the resources at their command. So in this simple, unexamined idea of capitalism with the market economy, those two dimensions go together naturally. So absolute control and decentralization, but they don't go together. In fact, they're in contradiction with each other. One of the most obvious ways to increase the level of absolute economic decentralization is to relativize the absoluteness of the control, to have property rights, claims on productive resources that are in different ways conditional or temporary or fragmentary, and then each of the agents has less absolute control, but there are more agents, and they have more access to the productive resources in more ways. Now, that's not what Karl Marx had in mind by capitalism, but it's certainly a market economy. And so that's the kind of basic analytical confusion that we immediately begin to get into. when we start to try and make sense of these ideas. That's the point.
Yeah, I'm not saying that capitalism is a precise term or the language that goes along with it. I'm just saying that it's not.
No, but I think it's more than that. I think when people use the term capitalism, I think in general, they don't mean a market economy. They do not mean a market. They mean something like the market economy that has emerged in the modern West. That kind of market economy. So they have a particular historical reality in their minds as the referent of this concept of capitalism. And they're presupposing that a market economy could not be produced with radically different characteristics. As in the thought experiment I made just now.
Yeah.
There are many economic agents, but each of them has only a relative degree of control over the resources at his command. That's not, quote, capitalism. That's something else. And it could even be market socialism in the Marxist categories. So the historical experience doesn't correspond to this idea of the immutable types. In this case, the immutable types of regimes. Yes.
I just have a little disconnect between, I think I missed the connection. Like, you said that to not let go of some ideas, people tend to radicalize, or you think we should. But how do we have a diluted version of capitalism? I think, like, radicalizing, diluting necessarily.
So what I'm saying is that the semi-Marxists want to preserve this apparatus of ideas by loosening them.
Oh, okay.
For example, emphasizing the relative autonomy of culture or the relative autonomy of politics from these constraints. So rather than asserting the ideas in the strong form of the three illusions, they start to dilute them. And it's a dilution of causality, it's a dilution of the theory of regimes. That's been the main direction. The political Marxists, the cultural Marxists, so-called Western Marxism, which emphasized culture and consciousness, it's been a way of taking this apparatus of ideas and opening the space for alternatives in it. That's what I mean.
And do you think we should radicalize?
I think this is not a promising direction because it neither accepts nor rejects the illusions of false necessity. It has an undefined relation to them. And it resolves the issue, as it were, by not talking about it. And I think that's not a satisfactory outcome for social theory. Because then if we ask ourselves, are we Marxists or not, we don't know the answer to that question. It's a kind of equivocation with ourselves. That's the result that has prevailed. Yes?
When you talk about how the vocabulary has been retained, but without the conceptual precursors that should be, if you look at all the second illusion of indivisible system, isn't it necessary that in a transformative system where certain parts are being changed but not the entire, not a full scale change of the system, that some part of the vocabulary would prevail? And isn't that like almost like a historical necessity? That certain concepts of
No, because that is already a fundamental change in the ideas. If you begin to say, for example, Keynesianism, counter-cyclical management of the economy through fiscal and monetary policy, is that a change in capitalism? Most Marxists would say Keynesianism is only a form of reformism. It's a reformist management of the market economy. So at what point does reformism become something else? That's the issue that's not faced squarely. So that's the main direction that Marxism has taken. Now, this, by the way, is just a chapter of the history of modern social thought. This is the chapter in which, for the most part, the leftists around the world are caught, because they still have a relation to these Marxist ideas. It's not the main line of social science and policy discourse, which has put all of this aside. And that brings me then to the second chapter of my discussion, which is the contemporary social sciences. And so what have the contemporary social sciences done? They have, for the most part, rejected the illusions of false necessity only by suppressing the whole idea of structure and of structural discontinuity, of structural alternatives. But each social science has done this in a different way. So it's like that beginning of Anna Karenina and Tolstoy. All happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So the unhappiness of the social sciences is the way in which they deal with the relation between the existent and the possible. So this is the essence of insight, right? In every science, in every discipline. How do you understand something? You understand something to the extent that you understand what it can become. That's how you understand something. Insight is always transformative. Insight is about what something can become, not ultimately. It's not the ultimate possible. It's the adjacent possible. Under certain provocations or interventions, what can a phenomenon become? If you have a natural phenomenon, the way you understand it is by having a set of views about its transformative possibilities in the realm of the adjacent possible. That's the whole nature of causality and causal explanation. If you don't have this transformative insight, you don't understand it. So you just label it or rationalize it, but you have no real insight into it. So insight is always transformative. Now, each contemporary social science has severed this link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. But each has severed it in a different way. Now, I want to give the example of economics, because economics is the best organized and most influential of the positive social sciences. And let's see what has happened in economics to this idea of structure, of institutional structure. So first of all, what do we mean by economics? Economics is not the study of the economy, as you might imagine. Economics is the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. That's what economics is. The application of this method to subjects that seem to have no relation to the problems of production and change is generally regarded as economics. On the other hand, the study of the economy by some other method is not seen as economics. For example, Max Weber's ideas in his masterwork, Economy and Society, about the functioning of the so-called capitalist economy is not regarded as economics. That's something else. The social theory of the economy, the sociology of the economy, or whatever. So we're looking at economics in this highly defined sense of being the evolution of a method, the study of a method, and the practice of that method. So from the standpoint of its implications for the understanding of these institutional and ideological regimes in history, we can distinguish three types of economics. So first there's pure economics. This is the orthodox marginalist economics. And its subsequent evolution, for example, to general equilibrium theory in the middle of the 20th century. This economics, what I'm calling pure economics, makes no institutional assumptions whatsoever. It has no institutional implications. And it was established definitively in the middle of the 20th century in the debate between the conservative economists and the socialists, Oscar Lange especially, that the apparatus of marginalist economics could be applied without problems even to a command economy. There was no analytical difficulty. So pure economics has no institutional message and makes no institutional commitments. In fact, one of the motives for the development of marginalism at the end of the 19th century was to try and create a method of economic science that would be invulnerable to the ideological and causal debates that were prevalent at that time, at the time that marginalism arose. They wanted to create a form of economic science that would be less a causal inquiry than an equivalent to logic, a form of logic. So that's pure economics. Has no institutional message, no institutional presuppositions, and no institutional consequences. Now then there's a second type of economics which we could call fundamentalist economics. And it's represented by part of the so-called Austrian school. And it's the ideological economics associated, for example, with the school of Hayek. And it says that its object is a particular version of the market economy. Very like the version that Karl Marx had in mind and that he labeled capitalism. And it said that these rules that define the market order emerge automatically and spontaneously. They are the spontaneous content of an order of impersonal coordination. So I said in an earlier class, if Robinson Crusoe traded long enough on his island, he would automatically generate the whole system of 19th century German private law. That's the idea of fundamentalist economics. So it is a system, and it arises from the spontaneous activity of trading, of coordination. Now there's a third type of economics, which is instantiated by the American practice of macroeconomics. Now just give me a minute, 2 minutes, I'll be right back.
You did, you know how all the paper has to do. There's no limit.
Pretty much.
Did he say? Like 3?
There's no
Yeah. Watch you guys do like 20. Watch you guys do like 20.
Somebody like, I don't know, I haven't figured out the topic
Yeah, I
yet.
don't have a topic, I don't even have 2 pages.
But it doesn't have a word description. I have no idea what that's sufficient.
Sure you do. Definitely not. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, essentially what I'm saying. It's just as a real like
This is impossible. Or this way, it's like, this is this way.
It's like a game.
So the third practice of economics, which I'm going to call equivocating economics. And it is exemplified by the practice of macroeconomics, especially by the American followers of Keynes. And what it does is it explores supposedly law-like correlations among large-scale economic aggregates, such as the levels of saving, investment, and employment. So it says, for example, that there is a regular law-like relation between the level of inflation and the level of employment. That's known as the Phillips curve. And if you question the macroeconomists and ask them whether these law-like correlations don't depend on a whole host of background institutional details. For example, the way labor is organized, the level of unemployment insurance, and so forth. So if you change any of those details in the background, these law-like correlations would shift. They will then, their tendency will be to concede and say, yes, that's true. They will concede that the law-like correlations depend on this whole detailed institutional background. But then they'll say, if in fact the background is unchallenged, if it's relatively stable, because the situation in the society is one of relative institutional stagnation, we can disregard this argumentative concession and we can go back to doing what we were doing before, which is to claim that there are these law-like correlations. In other words, confusing stability with lawfulness. That's what I'm calling equivocating economics. So we have pure economics with no institutional implications, fundamentalist economics, reifying a particular kind of market, and equivocating economics, wanting to have it both ways, recognizing that everything depends on the institutional details, and that the institutional details might change, but then disregarding that concession in practice. So that's an example of a contemporary social science. It's not a coherent way of dealing with the problem of structure. As you can see, each of these three responses, the equivocating, the fundamentalist, and the pure, is in a different form, an evasion of the imperative of structural vision. And that's what's characteristic of the contemporary social sciences and contemporary policy discourse. So what's the conclusion of all of that? If you now add what I said about Marxism and what I'm saying about contemporary social science, as in the example of economics, the conclusion is that on the one hand, we have the classical idea of structure, which is no longer believable or usable. And on the other hand, in contemporary social science, we have no idea of structure. That's the summary of the situation. So we are then in this circumstance of not having a way of thinking or talking about structural change, structural discontinuity, and structural alternatives. So let me relate that to the dilemma that I invoked in the very first class of a programmatic argument. Remember, I said, I propose something to you that's far from what exists. You say, that's very interesting, but it's utopia. Then I propose something that's close to what exists. And you say, well, that's feasible, but it's trivial. And almost anything that can be proposed will likely be derided as either utopian or trivial. And I said, that arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of a programmatic argument. It's not about blueprints. It's about sequences, successions. It's music, not architecture. But that dilemma and its motivation are aggravated by a contingent feature of the history of social thought, of social theory and social science, which is that for the reasons that I've just explained, we have no usable way of thinking about structure. And because we have no usable way of understanding how structural change takes place, we fall back on a fake criterion of political realism, which is proximity to the existent. That is, that a proposal is realistic if it approaches what already exists. And it's not realistic if it doesn't. Now, that's not a consequence of any idea about structural change. That's just this declaration of intellectual bankruptcy. We don't have a way of thinking about structural change. So we say it's feasible if it's close to what exists. And that results immediately in the rhetorical dilemma that I just described. So that's then the practical consequence of the intellectual history that I just recounted. Were you going to say something?
I was going to ask a clarifying question.
Yes.
I think I understand the ways in which pure economics and macroeconomic models don't have a coherent view of structure, but I'm a little less clear how the fundamentalist economic piece does, or if it's like the structure.
So the fundamentalist economics, it does have a view of structure, but it's a manifestly false view. Remembering the following, that the greatest analytical achievement of legal thought from the middle of the 19th century, from about 1850 to the end of the 20th century, was precisely the deconstruction of the idea that a market order has a single natural and necessary legal form. That's what legal thought achieved. So for example, you take an early version of this, Oliver Wendell Holmes. You start out with the abstract principles of private property and freedom of contract. And then the idea is you go down the ladder of increasing degrees of concreteness. For example, the relative rights of neighbors on a river, upstream and downstream, and their obligations to one another. And the question that the jurists posed was, can you derive the answers to those questions by inferring back to the general idea of the market? And the answer that the jurists felt compelled to give, against their own intentions, was that you can't. That the answers to those questions will depend on settling conflicts of interest and of vision, and that you can't infer the answer from the abstract conception of a market. That was the result. So the final result of this analytical achievement of legal thought was to entirely deconstruct that idea that a market order has a single natural and necessary form. The deconstruction of that idea by the jurists never fully penetrated the inner sanctum of practical economics. And fundamentalist economics is the expression of that. Because it's in direct contradiction to what the jurists discovered. So it's just false. And they're claiming that a spontaneous order automatically always converges to the same set of rules, which are the rules they're familiar with in their society. And it's not true. There's no automatic convergence to any particular regime of a market order. A market order can be organized, and it has been organized in radically different ways. So that's the point. Huh? So it seems to me that the main consequence of all of this that I've described is negative. It's that we have this great efflorescent classical social theory, and instead of the resulting problem being worked through to some other resolution, it was essentially just set aside. It was diluted by the Marxists themselves and set aside by everyone else. And then contemporary social science took a different direction, which on the whole is a non-structural direction. And that's where we are. Of course, the historical situation of the contemporary societies is an incitement to that negative result. Because what happens is that if societies are in the midst of struggles over structure, then there's a reason, there's an inspiration for social thought to have ideas about structure. But on the whole, the contemporary societies aren't, especially the rich societies with the developed academic establishments. So for them, this idea of radical experimentation with the forms of social life is on the whole a remote fantasy. And then in the parts of the world which might have a more direct experience of contest over structure, there isn't the development of theory. So where there are the intellectual resources, the practical inspiration fails. And where there's the practical inspiration, there isn't the intellectual apparatus. So that's one of the ways in which you might begin to explain this situation. But however you explain it, the result is obviously entirely unsatisfactory. That's where we are. So I think that my result is not a result which would be acceptable to the social sciences, and it also wouldn't be acceptable to the Marxists. So it's because it's a complete negation of the consequences of this social theoretical progression. Yes.
So if there is a new theory of structure that is not utopian, but it's adjacent,
Yes.
such as what you've laid out in different
Of course.
forms, right? Does it have to be tied to law-likeness, like in some sort of rational scientific?
No, I mean, this is related. I mean, so we have to have a way of thinking about structure. And it can't take the form of a simple refusal to admit and to explain the reality of constraint. So the failure of all of these attempts that I've described in classical social theory and contemporary social science doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all and that we can have whatever we want. We need a different way of thinking about structure. And that's then the point. That's then the next chapter of these remarks. So, yes.
You said that social science moved away from structural thinking. Was that largely a result of folks not being as interested in thinking about things in a Marxist framework, along with the compromise that we talked about between the social democrats and the classical liberals? Is that what kind of was the emphasis behind the move away?
Well, I do think that there's a broad and loose relation of this intellectual outcome to the counter-revolutionary temper of the current historical period. So in the rich countries, what has prevailed since the middle of the 20th century has been what I call the social liberal or the social democratic settlement. And it was distinguished by a retreat from any attempt to reshape the institutions of the regime. So that was the background. So the background was the background in which the reality of historical experience was the reality of abandoning experiments with structural change. Now, as you know, I think that none of the problems of the contemporary societies can be adequately solved or even addressed unless we reopen the terms of that social democratic compromise. And so we have to go back to thinking structurally. But we can't think structurally in the bad old way of imagining that structural change is this systemic change, replacement of one system by another, the old Marxist one. So we have to think structurally, but we have to think structurally in a different way. So there is now a reason, I believe, for the reconnection of our historical experience with our intellectual ambitions. But it's not manifest, it's not worked out. And so just to jump ahead in my exposition and to relate this now to law and legal thought, so here's the obvious connection. If structural change is always fragmentary and is not the substitution of one ready-made system for another, where do we go to find institutional variation and contradiction in its detailed form? We go to the law. That's what the law is. And so that then is, as it were, the enormous intellectual opportunity represented by legal thought. But then we need also a way of thinking about law as being about that, as being about institutional alternatives, and not just being simply this attempt to put the best face on the existing regime and to represent it in law as a perfectible plan, which is the main spirit of this rationalizing legal analysis. So that's the broad way in which there's a connection to legal theory. So I thought that what I do now in the third chapter of this discussion is just to signal some of the general elements of a different way of thinking about structure. As I say, it's not the outline of a social theory. It's simply some of the criteria, the building blocks, the components of a different way of thinking. And what they are. So first, that a structure is not a system. We reject the binary view of politics. A structure is not a system. Its components reinforce each other and are subject to what you could call, in Trotsky's vocabulary, combined and uneven development. So you change a structure part by part. But the failure to change other parts will always impose constraints on how far you can go in changing one part without changing the other part. So what happens in practice? What happens is that you try to push change in one part, and you go as far as you can, and then you hit against a limit, which is imposed by the failure to change some other parts. And then you turn to the other parts. So that's the reality of what I'm calling structure, not system. Now, the second element is this, and this is a very interesting aspect of the historical debate about Marxism. So, regimes differ in their ability to sustain functional advantages for the contemporary societies, becoming rich, powerful, and so forth. And of course, Marx himself thought of this relation between regimes and functional advantages in a one-to-one way. That's the essence of his theory, that the fundamental reason for a change of regime, the substitution of one mode of production by another, is that a mode of production comes to impose a constraint on the development of what he called the forces of production. And then there has to be a revolution, that is a substitution of one regime for another, to permit the forces of production to develop to the next stage. And so there is a powerful functional element in the history of regimes, meaning that the ability of a regime to support a certain level of functional advance, economic prosperity, military power, and so forth, helps explain its propagation. So the consequence becomes a cause. The fact that it can produce a certain consequence has a causal influence on its dissemination. Darwinism is such a functionalist theory. It explains the propagation of a species, of a form of life, by its success. But in history, there is no one-to-one relation between regimes and functional advantage. What we have discovered in history is that the same level of functional advantage can always be based on alternative institutional arrangements. there's always more than one way. There's also always an open list of ways in which a certain level of functional advantage can be supported by institutional arrangements. So a society, for example, that develops high technology production could be organized as China is or as the United States is. There'll be a range of ways. There won't be one way. And in the competition of regimes, then, the competition with respect to their ability to sustain these functional advantages, the institutional alternatives are selected from what's available in the historical moment. And the extension of this list of historically available options, kind of analogical extension. You're not choosing from the shelf of the abstract historical possibilities. You're choosing from the live options as extended by the imagination, by the programmatic imagination. So there's a competition for the functional effects of these regimes, but the competition is not with the abstract possibilities, with all the possible forms that you might imagine. The competition is for what's available, among the available options, or among the options that you could create on the basis of the available options. So you're selecting the institutional details from the existing sequences. And there is then this relation between the functionalist element and the deep structure element. The deep structure element is the history of these institutional alternatives. So let's say that's the second building block or theme. Now, the third element is this. I'm going to use the conception of the path of least resistance. So when there's some development in the world, for example, some set of innovations, like the innovations that today we think of as representing the knowledge economy, high technology manufacture, new technologies, the tendency is to adapt those innovations in the form that least disturbs the ruling interests and the prevailing preconceptions. That's what I'm calling the path of least resistance. So, the knowledge economy that exists today, the insular knowledge economy, present in every sector of the economy, of the production system, but in each sector present as an island, as a fringe, that excludes the vast majority of workers and of businesses, is a characteristic example of the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance has an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is that it's easier to implement because it involves less disturbance to the ruling interests and preconceptions. The disadvantage is that it characteristically underutilizes or underdevelops the potential of those innovations. And that's exactly the case with the insular knowledge economy. The insular knowledge economy denies the advanced practices of production to the majority of the labor force. And as a result, it becomes a driving force of both economic stagnation and economic inequality. So the enemies of the path of least resistance have something on their side. What they have on their side is that the path of least resistance is always shortchanging the potential of the transformation of the innovations. And I give you as an example, the contest now over the fate, the future of the knowledge economy. Can we have a knowledge economy for the many, as opposed to just a knowledge economy for the few, or not? That's a third element. Now here's the fourth element in this approach to structure. The fourth element is that the sense in which a regime, a structure exists is variable. A structure can be more or less entrenched. It can be organized in a way that insulates it against challenge and change, or it can be organized in a way that facilitates its own revision in the light of experience. And this is a feature of the differences among structures that is not observed in Marxism or in contemporary social science, but is very crucial. And let me relate it then to another large theme in the history of social thought. So, in the 19th century, the progressives, the liberals, the socialists, both liberals and leftists, tended to believe that the particular institutional direction that each of these political sects proposed favored both the development of our practical powers, our economic prosperity, and our moral development, our emancipation from entrenched social division and hierarchy. So, for example, the liberals, like John Stuart Mill, thought that the same institutions would help develop prosperity and practical power and freedom. And the socialists thought the same thing. Now, we have trouble believing that. We have trouble believing that there's a pre-established harmony and automatic convergence between the institutional conditions that favor economic power or prosperity and the institutional conditions that favor our moral emancipation. And we're threatened by an equally grave dogmatism which inverts this. Okay? There's a tragic contradiction between the institutional conditions for economic development and the institutional conditions for our moral emancipation. But we might believe the following, that there is some area of possible intersection. There's a subset of the institutional forms of our economic development that would serve our moral emancipation. And there's a subset of the institutional conditions of our moral emancipation that would serve our intellectual development, our economic development. And it seems, and now this is a hypothesis, that a characteristic of the institutional arrangements in this, what I'm calling the zone of intersection, is that they facilitate our experimentation. That they lend themselves to challenge and change. In other words, that they be disentrenched, using the vocabulary that I just used about entrenchment and disentrenchment. So, the institutions that are most likely to have this ability to serve both our economic progress and our moral advance, our freedom, are institutions that have this characteristic of laying themselves open to challenge and change. And this is connected with an idea about our historical circumstance. So the idea is that we have a problem that has no historical precedent, which is the following. Like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we also have reason to not entrust our futures to dogmatic institutional blueprints. So we have an unprecedented task, which is to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. And this creates a special place, a special role for this view of institutions that I'm describing, which emphasizes this question of the extent to which they insulate themselves against change, or on the contrary, facilitate their own transformation. So, a high-energy democracy, a deepened and disseminated form of the knowledge economy, are institutional and political forms that facilitate their own transformation. Now, finally, let me add a fifth element to this sketch of elements of an alternative approach to structure. So, the fifth element has to do with the reverse side of programmatic proposals, which is a conception of agency and of interest, of class interests and coalitions. Every project has to build its own base. A transformative project, a structural project, fragmentary but cumulative, doesn't rely on an antecedent social base, it builds its own base over time. But how could it build its own base over time? So here is this point that there is always a division, a duality of ways of defining and defending class and group interests. There is always a way of defining and defending a class or group interest that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive. And there's always another way that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. So the canonical example is the example of how should we understand the interests of the organized labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, and especially in mass production industry. That was the core historical constituency of the left parties in the Western countries. So, the institutionally conservative and socially exclusive way of defining and defending the group interests would be to say, we'll build ourselves into our present niche in the technical division of labor, which is to be employed in these mass production factories like the Rust Belt in the United States. And if we can't guarantee a future for this, at least we'll buy ourselves a few more years by constraints on plant closings, by subsidies, and so forth. And in that defense, in that rearguard defense of our niche, all the groups closest in social space to us will be our enemies. So the underclass workers, the foreign workers, the small business class, and so forth. But the leaders of these workers and the political forces that represent them might think there's no future in this. The Rust Belt is not coming back. These mass production industries have no future. We have to convert them into something else. We have to convert them into instances of the knowledge economy. That would be the institutionally transformative way of defining and defending the class interest. And in that process of converting them into something else, those groups that we used to think of as our adversaries have to become our allies. That's the solidaristic element. So you notice how this way of thinking about the relation between projects and interests is the exact opposite of the classical Marxist way. Because the classical Marxist way was to say, class interests have an objective content. And the more intense the degree and the wider the scope of class conflict, the more the objective content is manifest. And this is the opposite, because this is saying, as the conflict increases, the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the alternatives? And who would I become under these alternatives, these proximate alternatives? And what would my interests and my identity then be? So instead of the class interests acquiring greater objectivity, it's the opposite. The question of the objective content of the interest becomes inseparable from the question about structural alternatives. So those are the 5 or 6 elements of a different way of thinking about structure. And then I just have one final stage then in this discussion, but before going there, let me stop, yes.
Forces of production in a Marxist context. What is forces of production?
So the forces of production in Marx means the development of the economy. So he says, mechanized manufacturing, for example, could not flourish under feudalism. It can only flourish under capitalism. So the maximal development of the forces of production is the basic functionalist explanation in Marx for the substitution of regimes, of one regime by another. And I observed earlier in the list of my conceptions there, of my presuppositions about the approach to structure, that the same level of functional advantage can always have alternative institutional bases. There isn't a one-to-one relation between functional advantage and structure. So there are always alternatives. Characteristically, what prevails in the choice among those alternatives is the logic of the path of least resistance. Choose the alternative that least disturbs the established interests and the established preconceptions. And that alternative, that path of least resistance, will characteristically have the disadvantage of understating or underutilizing the potential of the innovation. That was the argument.
And then part of your insight is kind of moving away from Marx's one-to-one functional advantage framework is the analogy that you use in natural history kind of informing that. Because we know instead of like evolutionary being this and then that, it's really more of a tree, and that there's multiple species that have come out of it. Is that correct?
Correct. But of course, there's a difference between human history and natural history.
Sure, yeah.
Because we have moral aims, and that was the point of saying, of drawing attention to this other feature, that these structures differ in the extent to which they entrench themselves, they insulate themselves against challenge and change, and present themselves to us falsely as if they were part of the nature of things, of the furniture of the universe, rather than being our own creations, which we can therefore reshape. And my conjecture is that an attribute of the structures that have the greatest potential for us is that they have this feature of facilitating their own transformation, which then allows them to serve as a basis for both our moral interests and our material interests. So it's related, for example, to the theme in the choice of constitutional regimes of the preference for a constitutional regime that weakens the dependence of change on crisis. So it's not organized under to produce the result that there'll only be change when there's crisis, a war or an economic collapse. Crisis will always help change, but it will become less necessary to change as the enabling conditions change. Yes?
It might be coming later, but this Venn diagram subset of moral and economic development where they come together.
Yes.
I don't have a picture yet of what that looks like and how those different structures, alternative structures
Well,
are
I
created.
mean, take the example of a deepened and disseminated knowledge economy. So a knowledge economy for the many. It develops the forces. It has an economic advantage because it doesn't condemn the majority of the labor force to make work. You say, we'll give you access to the most advanced method of production. At the same time, it diminishes economic inequality by putting more of the labor force in the advanced part of production and gives them at least an opportunity for creative work. So it's also a device of emancipation. So a knowledge economy for the many or a high energy democracy are examples of institutional forms that facilitate their own revision and that lie in this zone, which I call the zone of intersection between the institutional conditions for the development of our practical powers and the institutional conditions for the achievement of our moral interests. So it's a search, right, in which we're saying there isn't some pre-established historical script, as like the orthodox Marxist would say, says this is the wave of the future. But we will make the future. We won't just find it in this script. We will make it. And our interest is to develop it in a form that consults both our material and our moral interests. That's the zone of intersection.
This may be too practical, and not really a moral thing, but it's about the knowledge economy. You know, I always wonder, let's just say we try wholesale retraining, real opportunity. For, let's say, someone who's a factory worker that loses their job and wants to get poured into something having more to do with computers or some nouveau economy opportunities for creativity. What if they don't have the agency to actually want to take up the challenge?
Well, so, I mean, we have to have a very large conception of agency, right? It can't be a univocal grid that we impose on humanity. But this is a bet, this is a gamble, that the enhancement of agency is seductive. And it's universally seductive. Everyone wants to be someone. Everyone wants to have some form of power, to resist, to stand up. And it's a gamble on that idea, right? That this ideal will exercise tremendous magnetic power on humanity. And of course, I think this is an idea that was fundamental in Marx, this idea of freedom. And Marx should be seen ultimately as a theorist of freedom and not just as a theorist of equality. Now, just to complete the discussion, this final section, and make obvious what I hope already is obvious, which is the connection to legal theory on this view of structure. So I already anticipated, if we have this idea of structure that I've just anticipated or sketched, structure advances in a fragmentary and piecemeal form, and everything depends on the details. The details exist as law. That's the general significance. Now, legal thought then, legal theory, has two vocations. A lesser vocation and a greater vocation. The lesser vocation is its use in adjudication. And then what we should want would be a form of legal reasoning that is purposive. It's not mechanical or conceptual, but it resists the idealizing and systematizing character of the principle-based and policy-oriented style of legal analysis. It is close to the ground, contextual, and purposive, but it is not systematizing and idealizing. And that's the lesser vocation. The greater vocation of legal thought is to inform the public conversation in the democracy about its alternative futures. These alternative directions of institutional change. And the obvious problem that we encounter in thinking through this greater vocation is the problem of agency. Who is going to do this? And in what form, we don't know, because the agent, the pre-existing agent doesn't exist, never exists. The task always exists before its agent. And the interest of the jurist is, of course, to get important work for them to do. And this higher vocation imagines that their ideal addressees will no longer be judges. They won't be whispering into the ears of the judge. They will be the assistants of the citizenry and of the political forces. Now, remember what I claimed in the very first class were the salient defects of this regnant form of legal discourse. I'm calling rationalizing legal analysis, principle-based and policy-oriented style of legal analysis. The first is the mystification of law. It presents law as a system. Law is not a system. In every area, we find characteristically dominant solutions surrounded by a penumbra or periphery of alternative contradictory solutions, anomalies, and deviations. And this objection applies to both vocations, the greater and the lesser vocation. The second defect of the established form of legal analysis is that it represents a form of usurpation of democratic power by the legal analyst, who under the disguise of interpreting the law and improving it, in fact, arrogate lawmaking power to themselves. And this applies especially to the lesser vocation. They should abandon their idealizing and systematizing ambitions in the adjudicative setting. And then the third objection is the most fundamental, and it applies squarely to the greater vocation. The fundamental objection is that this idea of legal analysis squanders the fundamental comparative advantage of legal thought, which is that because it deals with structure at the level of significant institutional detail, it allows for the rethinking or the remaking of structure piece by piece, part by part, step by step, from the inside out, from the bottom up. And the rationalizing style of legal analysis squanders that advantage in return for this hope of putting a halo of systematic idealization on the existing law. And it should be, the halo should be resisted, is the argument. So I've actually completed my commentary on structure, which was a voyage through very abstract and difficult themes of social theory. But I hope sufficiently clear to bring out the central points. And I think what we have to do in the remainder of the seminar then is to bring this down to earth in many different ways. And starting next week with an exposition by one of our colleagues here. And so I would like you to think of your own participation, your own contribution, and encourage you to come forward. You can write to me, speak with me, and volunteer to make such a presentation in the class. We'll continue next week.